Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits. Not yet a Knight of the Realm, but certainly I do live in the realm of the Knight, which is a subtly different thing. But of course anyone who regularly goes to the theatre is presumably doing the same thing. Well, as you probably know, London seems to be having a little bit of problem holding on to its new musicals recently. We've had a number come, and regrettably, we've had a number go. And as far as I can see, the number is exactly the same for both. We've had From Here to Eternity, Stephen Ward, and I Can't Sing come and go in diminishing amount of times. From Here to Eternity lasted 5 months or so. Stephen Ward lasted about 4 months, and poor old I Can't Sing lasted about 2 months. And certainly, whilst I didn't particularly rate From Here to Eternity, I thought Stephen Ward and I Can't Sing were excellent shows and really deserved to run a lot longer than they managed. We'll be talking in a future episode of Musical Talk about what seems to have happened to the London musicals and why these shows in particular haven't lasted, at least as far as we can tell or imagine. But we shouldn't let these shows go without what is now an obituary but would have been a tribute if it was still running. And so today I'm joined again by Tim Saywood to discuss Andrew Lloyd Webber's latest musical, which is, or I should now say, was Stephen Ward. We went to see it shortly before it closed and were both surprisingly impressed. And as you'll hear from the following episode, we really found a great deal to like in it, and certainly very little to dislike. There's no good reason why this show should have closed so soon, so I simply don't know what's happened to the London Theatre, which could explain it. However, let's not enter this in sadness, let's enter this in happiness, for Andrew Lloyd Webber has simply turned on his quality tap again and given us a brand new, wonderful show which I hope will survive into the realm of a national tour and revivals, even though its London run came to a premature end. Here's Tim Saywood and me talking about Stephen Ward. Musical Talk. Well, hello Tim, it's nice to see you here. It's nice to see that you haven't been hounded to commit suicide by the establishment.
It is, isn't it?
And
it always gives me pleasure every time I get up in the morning. Another day that the establishment's left me alone.
They're ignoring you, so they're luring you into their trap.
Very much unlike...
Well, Stephen Ward, the new musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber.
I'm not sure the establishment... Well, I suppose the establishment has sort of lined up against that, but I meant the man himself, which is indeed by Lloyd Webber, and also Don Black, and also Christopher Hampton, both previous collaborators of his. Yeah, exactly. Don Black on many things, Tell Me on a Sunday, Sunset Boulevard, and some other stuff. I forget exactly what. But
he's a lyricist of note.
Certainly, and I think Christopher Hampton also has had a previous collaboration. I think that also was Sunset Boulevard. So yes, that team taking on another tatty 60s icon. Tacky, I should say.
Icon? That's interesting.
Well, I suppose
Let's start immediately.
Stephen Ward himself is not an icon.
No,
I mean, the iconic figure in this, well, there are two. Christine Keeler is perhaps the most iconic of the figures in it. Because
not least for sitting on a chair backwards with no clothes on.
Indeed, yes, exactly. And we've all tried that and never achieved the quite same status as she did.
I used a Queen Anne armchair, though.
And less iconically, Profumo, who is very much a secondary character in this particular
but after whom the speech marks, the scandal, is named. It is the Profumo scandal, 1963.
What the writers of this seem to have concluded is that actually the central relationship is that between Keeler and Stephen Ward. In other words, the man whose flat she lived in for a very long time, free of rent, as far as we can tell, and his social circle, particularly Clifton, the Clifton set, which formed the basis for Profumo to have met her in the first place, and indeed a Russian bloke as well.
Well, in a nutshell, because it is now 50 years ago, and not everyone will be aware of... Most people in Britain will have heard of the Profumo affair, but not everyone will now be aware of its A, significance, or B, what it was that caused the trouble. And essentially, Christine Keeler was, to use the old-fashioned phrase, a call girl. So she had sexual favours with gentlemen, as you say, from the Clifton set, which is the stately home owned by Viscount Astor, and therefore you've immediately got aristocracy involved in the story. But the point is that John Profumo, who was Secretary of State for War, which is the Defence Secretary,
Yep.
had slept with her on a regular basis, so they'd had a short affair.
Yes.
But she had also slept with the Russian attaché,
Yes.
or the Soviet attaché, I should say.
Yep.
And this is in the Cold War days of the early 60s. And we have to remember the international context. We're after the Bay of Pigs here, where America and Russia very
Yes.
nearly nuked the world.
Yes, indeed.
So it's not
Starting
a
with
happy
each other,
time.
yes.
And the suggestion was that there was now a link between the Minister of Defence and somebody who was known to be a Soviet spy.
Yeah.
And could secrets have been spread that way? But more, that's the political aspect.
And then in
there's
the popular culture, it's
Yeah.
the first big sex,
Yeah.
political sex scandal. I mean, not that
Yeah.
there weren't any before, but it would have been much easier to hush these things up in the past. And I think this was the sort of a watershed for investigative tabloid-style journalism. And it was enough because, not necessarily because of the affair, but because he lied to the House, that's
Yeah.
what brought Profumo down. And the same technique had been used many times subsequently to bring down
Yeah.
other political figures and cabinet ministers and so on.
Well, ultimately, as you say, the much bigger context is not just the sex scandal, but the people involved in the sex scandal.
Yeah.
We had MPs and diplomats and aristocrats.
Yes, it was a big
and
expose.
Society movers and shakers. And it did ultimately, I think it must be said, it didn't bring down the government before an election, but
Yeah.
it certainly saw a long-lasting Conservative government swept from power.
That's true, yes. It's seen as a significant moment of power shift between this rather upstart media, with which Rupert Murdoch wasn't quite involved at this stage,
No,
but
wrong end of the 60s for him.
but certainly we were heading towards, I think we were the IPC sound at the time, and what was then known as the establishment,
Yeah.
Namely the judicial, the political, all of that kind of gubbins, except for the press,
Well,
and which the press had been part of at one time.
it
But-
also kickstarts the
but suddenly
60s
it
as a
wasn't.
social phenomenon. People often talk about the Beatles,
Yeah.
but it's actually the Profumo affair is suddenly when the sexual liberalisation...
Well, I think Philip Larkin said it succinctly with sexual intercourse began in 1963, somewhere between the Chatterley trial and the Beatles' first LP. And of course, this falls in exactly that period.
Well, 63 is often when the 60s are deemed
Yeah.
to have started. It is when social mores changed. You know, the social mores that had been in place up to the war had been propped up, reinstated as far as they could be after the war, and
Yeah.
propped up for as long as that could happen. And then it all came tumbling down. And this is the affair that did it.
Yes.
So whilst there's the details, there's the bigger picture.
And it's not the first time that anyone has picked up on that
No.
with its potential as a musical, because obviously it was a film, it was a big famous film in the 80s scandal, and there have been numerous musicalisations of it, none of which have really come to any great
Haven't been
success,
successful, let's be honest.
oddly,
yes.
given that it seems like a surefire sort of story. I mean, clearly to a lot of writers it seems like a surefire story. I've seen one previous attempt at it, which I think about 2006 at the Greenwich Theatre, which was called Model Girl. Didn't do anything, really wasn't a very successful attempt at it. And this is interesting, isn't it? Because it's a sort of, I think it goes some way towards doing it, but still doesn't quite pull it off.
Well, what we have, let's be honest about this. I think we both went in with some concerns that we were seeing it more out of duty than out of expectation. I think I was more interested in it than you were before we went in.
Yes.
But we were both extremely pleasantly surprised. It is not a flawless piece by any means.
No.
But it is not a flawed piece.
I didn't
that's
sit there
damaging.
hating every second of it, it's certainly
No.
true.
And actually, I'm going
I did
to...
with Model Girl.
Yeah. Well, right, then let me set the bar slightly higher. Now, I have never historically been a huge fan of Andrew Lloyd Webber. I like Evita and I like Joseph Animated Technicolor Doodah, but not to the point where I have them on my iPod and I don't own the albums. I'd go so far as to say that I don't like Phantom of the Opera and Love Never Dies and some of the even lusher stuff of his later career, the operetta end of the market. So I went to see this because I felt I ought to see it rather than because I particularly wanted to see it, although I was interested and intrigued to find out how he was going to deal with this fundamental point of British history of the last 50 years, indeed from 50 years ago. And I loved it. That's not to say I can't see its flaws, but actually, of all the Andrew Lloyd Webber scores he's ever written, this is the one I like most.
Okay.
The one I'm most likely to buy the album of.
Interesting.
Because I am intending to buy the album of this one.
And do you know Evita, personally?
Well, we had lunch once, but we just didn't hit it off.
No.
Yes, I have seen Evita. I've seen Evita on the stage, and it's excellent. But I haven't bought the album.
This to me seems, certainly in terms of the score and the style, this seems to me the closest thing that he's
Yeah.
written to Evita since Evita, because you can't really get much closer than the thing itself.
Ryvita.
Yes, exactly. Yes, a cheap,
That's the slightly
the low
ironic
calorie
version of
version.
it.
Yes, exactly. And so it seemed to have that. It had, in other words, there's quite a bit of lurid melodrama in it, not least the very opening number, which starts in the Chamber of Horrors in Blackpool, where there's I don't know if there is now, but there certainly was at one time.
This is a Madame Tussauds offspring. There was
Yes.
another branch of it, but it's not. As he says himself, I'm in the Chamber of Horrors for
Yes,
Madame Tussauds. I'm not even in the London one.
No, that's right. And there he is alongside Genghis Khan and
Hitler.
and other people of similar stature.
The acid bath murder, George Hayes.
That's right, yes. Which is a really odd bookending device, but anyway, let's come to that another time. And then we have A Tale of the 60s, very much a clearly drawn set of characters, albeit drawn very much, I think, out of the world of the popular novel of the 60s, I think.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we're in
Dolly Birds
not exactly
and-
James Bond territory, but sort of in that ballpark, which are written very comfortably by the writers involved, which is interesting.
Yeah, the book doesn't lurch.
No, exactly. And even the women characters, and again, I think you're right in describing them sort of as dolly birds. And they don't have a lot of complex inner life at all, do they? But then nobody does in it, so at least it's consistent.
But what they've got is they're not complex, but they feel real in a caricatured real way, if that makes sense. Let's compare this. We went to see this the same week that we went to see From Here to Eternity, and
Yes.
both pieces have two principal female parts.
Yes.
The two female roles in this version of Profumo, the Stephen Ward, infinitely better than
They feel a lot more
much more.
They feel they fit better in the context in terms of and it's much clearer as to what they're trying to do.
Also, you get the distinct personalities. Yes, because
Yes,
Christine Keeler is a much more thoughtful. Of the two, she's more discreet. You've got Mandy Rice Davis, who's quite keen on the camera and better with the sassy put downs, which she was in real life as well.
Yes, that's right.
But they're actually very nicely drawn.
And you get the sense of ambition from Christine Keeler and from Ward himself, and so on. So there's quite a lot of good stuff of that kind.
Can I give it a tone point, however? We will be comparing it every now and then with From Here to Eternity. It's the obvious thing. They both came onto London at a similar time and were both closed on the same night at the end of March. One is by Tim Rice and one is by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and of course their names will inextricably be linked even when they're not working together. So, there are some obvious parallels.
Yes.
But whereas, regrettably, From Here to Eternity, as we've said in another episode, is a little bit narrow in its range and flawed, whilst this is not flawed, and we will talk about the flaws of this, it has pep or brio or gusto. It's got something, it's got a kick to it, which keeps it, for the most part, travelling along at a nice pace. It's pacey enough, it's sassy enough, it's funny enough. It's not overly funny, it's not a deep, complex investigation in
By no means.
of the characters involved. But it was brighter, and actually, at the end of the day, it showed more professional skill. We said that at the time.
We have a difference of directors between the two pieces. There's Richard Eyre, who's directed this one, a man of immense experience and some time at the National Theatre and
he's one of Britain's foremost directors.
Exactly. And Tamara Harvey, who I know is a much younger and less experienced director on From Here to Eternity, and whether that was instrumental on turning one half-baked thing into a more fully baked thing, and one half-baked thing into just a half-baked thing. So we had that, and the staging here is a bit more coherent certainly than in From Here to Eternity. And the staging consists of a whole series of concealing and revealing curtains,
which I think tells its own subtext, doesn't it?
Which I think is exactly what the thinking was behind it. It actually has some interesting similarities to the set for The Woman in White, which was one of the first all-projection type of sets that there was in the West End.
And another Lloyd Webber.
And he was used it very interestingly in that particular thing. And that also had a whole load of travelling screens and a sort of circular radial type of pattern to them. So they obviously sort of picked up on the success of that. But here it's used in a very different way, and I think it is. There's a nice fluidity to the transitions this time, even more so than in that previous use of it.
I'd like to pick up on two things there. I thought the projection was all the stronger for not trying to be realistic.
Yes.
So, for example, you've got projections of newspaper headlines. And
we were more in the Joan
photographs.
Littlewood world of staging, which of course belongs to the 60s and therefore felt very coherent with the...
Well, Theatre Workshop was doing some of its best work in the early 60s,
indeed.
So you're right, absolutely contemporary. And also, the physical representation, you were talking about shielding and half revealing through the curtains, but there was also an inner circle of curtains and an outer circle of curtains, which absolutely reflects Stephen Ward's circle. There was him and Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis and his close friends, Lord Astor. And then you had the wider circle of people who popped into the story and out. And I tell you what's very interesting, if you go online, a lot of the reviews have said, this looks cheap. because it's just projection on curtains. But I think they have missed
No,
the point.
I
I
think-
think it's actually so much cleverer.
I think because I think people might think that, like, if that was presented in a smaller theatre or off West End, I think that would be a very good economical staging device. And it's just because everybody, when you get to the West End, expects the set to move around and have hydraulics
To
and whatever.
actually resurrect Stephen Ward to be in the piece, because
But-
you do that with West End.
But actually,
shows.
why?
Yes.
You know, it's not necessary. And
No,
I
it
thought
isn't.
this was a perfectly good staging device that was economical and worked.
But worked. No,
nicely.
it worked. That's
Yeah.
the point.
Exactly.
And it worked beyond what it was doing. Obviously, it was
Just because you'd normally expect that in a play than in a musical, so what? We could talk a little bit about the score, because I think there
We
are
should.
some, and perhaps the highlights of the score, because there are a lot of songs in it.
But can we contextualise it? Once again, comparing it to From Here to Eternity, where the reviews all said, look at the variety of the songs,
Yeah.
but we said yes, but they've all been written within a very narrow range. There's a huge variety of songs in this as well. Once again,
Yes.
diegetic and non-diegetic songs
Yes.
in a few cases. However, the range, because whatever one thinks of Andrew Lloyd Webber, he is a professional.
You
I'm
mean to
gonna
say
start-
he's actually made money at this?
Well, yeah, that's the point. At the end of the day, Andrew Lloyd Webber is highly experienced. This might be a better way of putting it.
Yes.
And and he's shown over again that he has actually got an enormous range. He can even stick a rock song in the middle of Love Never Dies where it doesn't fit at all.
Yes.
But he can.
I'll tell
pull
you
out
something
the
about
stops.
him that, you know, I mean, he's an enormously controversial figure, and we needn't go into that. But he does take risks.
Yes.
Not the sort of risks that one might think of as avant-garde or sort
No.
of, you know, that kind of risk. And he doesn't care so much, as I think you've just pointed out, about the sort of complete coherence of everything that he does. But he goes all out to sort of, you know,
Entertain?
entertain and to get
Yeah.
the attention. And I think whatever means take it. I was quite pleased to see the resurrection. This for me was a highlight. There was a song called Manipulation, and not just this one, but also in a couple of other areas as well. I was pleased to see the return of dissonance to Lloyd Webber, because we've had quite a few scores, particularly of late, where it's really downplayed, the dissonance, and here we had one or two nice unexpected transitions and transpositions that, again, I thought we hadn't really heard from him really since Evita.
Well, I agree
It wasn't
with you.
as brave a score
Yeah.
as Evita, but it certainly had echoes of it.
But in terms of his, if you look at his wide career from the 60s to now, if you didn't know the order things were coming in, I think you would put this score in the late
Absolutely
70s,
placed this, yes, exactly,
Yeah.
in that period.
which
yeah.
is actually his golden era.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes, you would put it back in the same way that Assassins by Sondheim, for example, feels like very much the work of someone earlier in his career,
Yes.
despite the fact that it turned up in 91, I think it was, or
It
whenever.
could have been a late 60s, early 70s sometime.
Easily,
Yeah.
and you know, for the same reasons. So it was like an idea from the early part of his career that was finally sort of seeing the light of day in this, dare we say it, autumnal stage.
Well, he is getting on.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, so I thought that was something I liked very much.
You said let's mention the songs. One of the songs, which was a song that people were singing in the show, was called the Super Duper Hula Hooper.
Oh yes,
Now, I'm not going to say for one second that's a great song, but in the
don't be a
films,
party pooper, be a super duper hula hooper.
and it's what the girls in Murray's nightclub, which is where Christine Keeler meets Ward for the very first time. So it's a sort of an evening nightclub, a sort of review bar, if you like, with scantily clad girls in a 60s scantily clad kind of a way. So it's mostly bikinis and hula hoops and
Yep.
headdresses.
Yes.
But in the film, I may have imagined this, but in the film Scandal, that scene is represented with the genuine song of the period called She Wore Red Feathers and a Hooly Hooly Skirt. Do you know
Right?
it?
No, I don't.
It's actually a fairly well-known sort of C-rated pop song of the period.
Right.
And this was a perfect, cleverly written pastiche of that kind of number, because it means nothing, and it's all about, you know, the titillation of the dance.
Yeah.
Using hula hoop, you know, a hooly hooly skirt. It's that Hawaiian influence of the...
Talking of the titillation,
Shall we?
let's go into, I think, the best number, which is You've Never Had It So Good.
And you've never had,
Had
it so often.
often. That's right, yeah. Not, I think, their original phrase. I'm pretty sure I've heard that
Private
before.
Eye coined You've Never Had It So Often.
Right, okay, fine, yeah. So, which, of course, is perfect for the time and
The Establishment
the
Club,
Establishment
the early
Club
60s,
and so on.
yeah, absolutely.
But that's a great success of a number, and the staging is highly exuberant. And
It's the showstopper of the piece,
and naughty in a way that would have seemed daring in the 60s, and obviously now is just sort of more of a nostalgic return to the sort of fetish world of personal services and that sort of thing.
More than one newspaper has observed that the song that most feels like not in staging, but in tone,
Yes.
is the Ascot Gavotte from My
Do you
Fair
know, I
Lady.
actually thought
Yeah.
exactly the same thing.
It's
after
got
we
that
saw
kind
it.
of stately,
Da,
weird,
da, da, da,
having
da, da.
sex kind of thing.
And what's interesting about that is that the Ascot Gavotte has a further life in Evita, because of course, as we know, there's going to be bum 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 bum, and then in Evita there's an extraordinarily similar tune which one cannot imagine wasn't he didn't have it in the back. Yes, exactly, which is. Da 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 dum bum 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 ba bum ba bum ba bum 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 ba bum 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 ba bum 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 and so on, and so very much in that sort of
well, Ascot Gavotte,
the light march type of thing.
Well, the Ascot Gavotte is about restrained enthusiasm, and that's exactly what this is about. This is sexual excess within the constraints of being
Basically,
British.
It's Lloyd Webber's way of just saying sort of, yes, the restrained British and their hypocrisy sort of thing. It's a good language for that.
But also it's very symbolic, isn't it, of the story that's being told. I mean, the story, we'll talk about this in a minute, the story about Stephen Ward is that he is the establishment's patsy, and he's not absolutely the villain that's he's been portrayed historically at the time, and most people now think was a bit of a miscarriage of justice, certainly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he stays dressed in this scene, where everyone else in the scene is having an orgy and is down to their very British underpants and their very British vests and their sock suspenders and their frilly panties and whatever. So everyone's doing this very restrained but strangely orgasmic scene, if you like, while singing these. Once again, the lyrics are funny.
Witty.
Yeah, witty. That's a much better way of putting it. But, it's a witty. Wit and lust are not often seen together.
No, although they do make very good bedfellows in this kind of context.
Oh, everyone makes a very good bedfellow in this context. But Stephen Ward sits there watching the scene fully dressed in a voyeuristic role, rather than being actually sexually active in it per se.
So, I mean, I think the first half really goes somewhere, and
sorry, can I just say that obviously points out that he's not absolutely part of the establishment.
No, exactly. Yes. So the first half, I think, sets all that up very well, and the act break was a slightly odd place to end it, I thought, but they found a dramatic, moment to the world was about to change, sort of thing. What did you think of Act 2 in comparison, which of course deals with the trial and the establishment hanging him out to dry?
Yes. Well. I think Act 1 is brighter than Act 2.
Yeah.
And you're quite right. But the structure of the piece is, here's the world that's being created, here's how we understand the world, it seems to be getting, no one sees the fall coming.
The first half is the party and the second half is the hangover.
That's a much better way of putting it. But the problem with that is the same with almost every other story where that particular dynamic is followed, is that putting everything back in the box again afterwards is much less fun than taking the toys out of the cupboard.
It is.
And you're right, if you've got a trial, now you need the trial because a trial is in itself dramatic, but it's a quiet drama. It's not an overt.
It's a more staid second half, and it is more difficult. I think what happens to the thing is that because you've got that tremendous lightheartedness in the first half, it establishes a very light-hearted tone for the whole piece, and of course, by the time we're therefore being called upon to start treating these people as real people, I think we do have a little bit more of a difficulty, because I think this, it turns more to melodrama as it goes on, because the characters in the first place haven't been completely given to us as real people.
They're cartoons.
They are a bit cartoony, yeah, exactly.
Or grotesques, at least.
Yeah, exactly. So which isn't to say they're not sympathetic, but the Stephen Ward character, I mean, we see him as this arch manipulator in the first half, and it doesn't necessarily, I mean, of course, manipulation is the
well, he's an osteopath, isn't he?
Which exactly is where the sort of metaphor comes from.
There's a lyric, isn't there? In fact, a song called Manipulation, where he says, "I stretch limbs while they stretch the truth."
Yes, I mean, it's kind of fairly laid on a plate for you there.
Yeah. And, well, it's made overt, isn't it? Yes. But it makes its point.
Yes. And as a result, we really can only sympathise with him because he's being sort of hanged to dry. But we don't necessarily see the virtue in what he was doing in the first place, and perhaps that's where...
Yes.
And perhaps that's where it's slightly harder to sort of care that he does get hung out to dry.
One of the newspaper reviews made the observation, and I think it's a fair observation, that in trying to sort of exonerate Ward from the entire guilt that's placed on him to sort of in an attempt to exonerate
he does become
else,
a scapegoat, yeah.
That he's sanitised.
Yes.
And he's not an innocent. He's just not guilty of what he's accused of necessarily.
Well, the way it's put, and often is put, I might add, in musical adaptations of this thing, is in this final song, "Too Close to the Flame." I.e., he's a sort of Icarus character who sort of has
indulged in pleasures which perhaps
he hasn't himself, but he's gotten very close to where serious real life happens, the high echelons of politics, and as a result has become a sort of collateral damage really when things changed. But it's also pointed out that that the establishment sort of feel that he wasn't as indispensable as he sort of thought he was, really, in bringing people together and whatever. If anything, the nexus there is around Asta, and not so much Ward himself. He's sort of a hanger-on.
Yeah. Well, Ward is the mechanic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about the land, as it always historically is in Britain and class stories.
Yes.
Yes. And Cliveden being the stately home around which all these things...
And he himself is not particularly... We don't see him, as coming from a working class background the way that we do with Keeler. And of course, Keeler, we don't get a feeling that she's hung out to dry in quite the same way, although I suppose she is.
Well, she eventually does go to prison in real life.
Yes, that's right, exactly.
In a way that Ward doesn't, because he commits suicide.
Yes, that's right. So it's kind of interesting that we don't sort of get that that feeling. And I think there's a... I don't think this team could ever have conceivably produced it, but there is a story about gender politics as much as the other kinds of politics in here.
Very much so.
That isn't told in this version any more than it's ever been told in the other versions I've seen. Don't know why.
Although it's odd, in some senses, there's a much more minor story which parallels the lack of power that women genuinely have at this time and in this story, which is Profumo's wife.
Yes.
We don't get to see much of Profumo's wife, and she is, she's the minor character of a minor character.
Well, she pops in. It's like the song is "I'm Hopeless When It Comes to You." It's a clever song, and it's inevitably placed there, I think, to be the one that a lot of women of a certain age will probably play over and over again in the kitchen while their husbands are out having affairs with younger women.
She forgives her husband for his infidelities.
Yes.
Even though, she shouldn't, but she's still in love with him, I think, is the point.
Yeah.
But it's actually a nice song.
I think it probably depicts the situation of quite a lot of middle-aged women, actually, and that's probably why it's in there.
Also, I think, and we discussed this on the evening, that in my view, this is the moment that proves you that this is a British musical and not a musical by any other country, because it immediately follows on from the scene where Profumo realises the jig is up for him, or at least
That's right.
something is hitting the fan, and he has to confess to his wife that
right.
he's had an affair.
Yes.
And she claims that she had no idea. Even though it seems to have been done under her nose in some cases. But there is the "I've had an affair, dear" kind of discussion. Yes. And it is done absolutely cold and brittle, and you feel the hurt without any shouting.
It's like a little mini Terence Rattigan play, isn't it?
But it is. That is exactly what it is. And it's the stronger for that. It is, and that's how many people would, in this day and age when there's still heightened emotion in this country since the death of Diana, I tell you.
I'm sure. I'm playing Profumo myself, himself, ironically enough.
Both affairs in their own ways, by the way. But to me, that felt very true, and therefore, because it hadn't been a screaming match with over-the-top emotions, I was much more happy to swallow the song that followed on afterwards.
There is a
even though it's a cliche.
Yes, I was going to say there is a sort of cliche of the Tory wife that that
it's
I
not
think
just a Tory wife.
No.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, but the establishment wife, who sort of understands that the price that she pays, as it were, for sort of the wealth is
tainted.
That's right. Is that there's going to have to be a certain amount of self-abnegation going on in the department of both sex and indeed in just her general importance to the world.
It's the lack of histrionics, which I thought
it's nice.
To me, that it doesn't speak to everyone, but it certainly speaks to me.
Yes. I don't know if she's there as a particular contrast, however, to to Keeler and
no, I don't think she is. I think she's powerless in the same way they're powerless.
Yes.
She's in better circumstances.
Yes.
Because they're on a foreign holiday when he has to break the news to her.
That's right,
the worst that happens to her is her holiday's cut short. But the same pain of the same inability to do anything. I mean, if she had left him,
yes, that's true,
she'd have disappeared into obscurity. She wouldn't have gone to the newspapers. In a sense, actually, she's got less to go for.
I wonder how it's possible to do the final suicide in a way that really works, because I think the least convincing...
Sorry, you actually want to kill the actor every night?
well not this particular night, no, I thought he was pretty good, but as a character he wasn't that sympathetic. And the two things that I really didn't like in this were, as I've mentioned before, the bookending device of the Chamber of Horrors, which just seemed extremely, contrived, really. I mean, it just didn't really seem to speak to what the show was about.
Nor was it needed, because if it hadn't been there, it wouldn't have made any difference.
It wouldn't really.
The story is
and
strong
not only
enough to carry
that, the
itself.
particular song, the Human Sacrifice song, was by far the worst song in the whole thing. Actually, wasn't a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a misstep at the start. I will accept that.
Yeah, and also we have this horrible thing of a monologue-y song that he does while taking the pills. always a bit of a close. I mean, this is with the most operatic conceit in it, I suppose, because we're used to sort of operatic sopranos with consumption getting through like a final number before they finally cark it.
Yes.
And
indeed,
and it does the same sort of thing here, which of course is just as eggy and cheesy as it would.
That's a lovely sandwich.
I know, exactly. Well, perhaps another kind of sandwich is perhaps what I'm getting at, but it didn't work. I felt that they could have done it more tastefully or more restrainedly, as you've praised that sort of scene about the affair for being, in a way that would have therefore elicited a lot more sympathy if he'd had just a little bit less self-pity at the end.
I think that's very, very fair. Can I just, once again, I want to draw a parallel with From Here to Eternity, which I say we saw in the same week. When the Pruitt character, the younger, and I'm not going to say hero, but the younger character, protagonist in that, finally gets shot by his own side at the end of the piece, he gets hit in the chest by a bullet. And then time sort of stops. Yeah. And then he sings this appalling song
dreadful,
about a sliver of metal going through his heart, and then how everything goes still while all the soldiers gather him round and pick him up and throw him about. And it's like he does one final gymnastics display before time starts.
Well,
again.
that reminded me of Billy Bigelow in Carousel, which is a scene I hate as well.
Billy Bigelow even goes on to heaven, though, so he escapes death.
There's a whole second half of the second act for that one, so at least it's not as bad as that. But that
was
type of thing.
Dreadful. But it's the point is that in that case, that would have been much better, I think, dramatically, if he had just been
have it
shot
bloody happen
and dropped dead, and then you'd have the shock of the protagonist not being there, and you didn't need the song. And I think there's an element of that here. I don't think you could just have him commit suicide without a song in this case, which you could have done in From Here to Eternity. But the song was
there was
a
bit more dignity they could have given him, and I think at the end by having him quietly walk off the stage.
There is a danger that we know that to make something a good musical, you have to progress the plot emotionally and narratively in a song, and not just illustrate what's happened in the narrative in a song.
Interestingly,
but there are lots of ways of doing it, and they're not all good.
No, and interestingly, Model Girl had a similar sequence in it, which was by far the most, among us for some very stiff competition, was the most risible thing in the whole thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he went around. I mean, it was done even worse in that, like he was literally walking around the stage, popping one pill after the other between lines of the song, and then finally sort of collapsed against a wall and just sort of, did a big sort of
I thought you were going to say, and then he looked down at the packet scene and saw they were laxatives.
Like, no!
I'll be right back, folks.
But the effect was not too dissimilar here, I'm afraid. Yeah.
I'm inclined to agree with you, though. I think that it was in a way, it was the punch that missed.
Interestingly, and thinking of Evita as quite a close parallel to this, of course, we do have the death, but of course, it's the reaction to her death by the people that gives us the strong context and the bookending, because it's bookended with her death in Evita, that really makes it work, because it's the significance and the mythicalized significance that she takes on. And of course all of that applies here as well, except that, as we pointed out at the beginning, he's not the character who becomes mythicalized. It's actually Keeler.
And quite the reverse, he's almost forgotten.
Yeah.
Because, as I said earlier, people know of the Profumo affair.
Yep.
They know very few of the details, but they will have heard of Christine Keeler, even if they don't quite know what. Mandy Rice Davies is the one who's the collateral success, if you like, because she got a reputation.
Well, she would be, wouldn't she?
Very smart. But she has a natural wit which has carried her through. Yeah. And indeed, there were photographs of her coming to see this when it opened in London.
Oh, right.
Mandy Rice Davies. So she's still connected with that.
Okay.
Well, she must have been, because the photographs made her look much better than being dead.
No, that's good.
But Stephen Ward is a name that you would only know if you knew the story with some level of detail. I mean, he's obviously one of the major players in it, but he's not known to history as a household name.
Except in Blackpool.
Well, yes.
And yes, well, a household.
As long as the household is Madame Tussauds,
exactly.
yes.
But all in all, it rolled along fairly satisfactorily, and although I think the second act sort of really lagged much more than the first act, the exuberant first act. The exuberant first act was perhaps enjoyable. Almost a shame they couldn't have just stopped it there, really.
Well, I'd like to address one more issue. Now, this musical is doing something which you actually don't see very much in musicals. We were talking earlier about Andrew Lloyd Webber taking risks. This is a musical that's trying to make a point. Now, whether you agree with the point is another matter, but it's actually saying the establishment stitched up an innocent in order to protect itself.
Not that controversial, one might say.
No, not now, but it is making that point. And so it's not just telling the story. It's telling a story and giving you an opinion which it wants you to either agree with or disagree with.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, that's quite unusual now in when I say conservative musical theatre, I mean commercial musical theatre.
Yes.
Can you think of another at the moment that's trying to make a point?
I'll probably put in a second.
Not recently, I should think.
I'm just trying to think now. Urinetown.
Hasn't opened yet.
No.
That's fair, but there aren't that many.
No, I think so. I don't really respect it for doing that, because I think it really if he'd written it in the 70s, that might have been sort of early enough that the.
Yeah.
But I don't.
You mean history has decided that they're right before they wrote the music?
I think pretty much they've waited until a bit like I suppose you could argue a bit like Oh What a Lovely War. You know, by the 60s there was still the need for some revisionism around the war, and about, like, you know, the traditional story of the war was the one that they were overthrowing at the time. But
not in this case.
But in this case, it was not like, you know, it needed the perception needed seriously correcting.
I accept that absolutely, but it's still.
They're not going up against the Daily Mail with this one, I don't think, even.
Well, yeah.
And if they are, then
no,
so
they're
what?
not particularly. But I tell you what's very interesting is that all the newspaper reviews are addressing the issue that the piece raises.
Yes.
In most cases, as you say, they are saying, yes, we agree that the judge was hostile and it's clearly the establishment stitching him up in order to save themselves. However, they're discussing the point it's trying to make, almost more than actually discussing the musical itself. The reviews, there obviously have been two sets of reviews for this, because it's announced it's closing. Yeah. There are the original reviews from December when it opened, and then there's the kind of subsidiary reviews where people say, oh, I always knew this was going to fail, when it announced it's closing in February, at the end of March. However, if you look at the December reviews, the original ones, opinion is actually quite positive, but for the most part they are discussing the issues raised rather than the musical as a piece. And I haven't read a review of a musical where that has been addressed by the reviewers, that the question that's asked has actually been answered.
No,
I mean, the answers are yes, you're right,
but...
And I'm not trying to make a big thing of it, because, as you say, what's the point of having a discussion about something everyone agrees
actually,
with?
while you've been talking, I mean, London Road... has occurred to me, you know, as
what's the question London Road's asking?
Well, it's that's a good. Well, okay, that is a good
just
question.
Just because it's based on truth, but I'm not sure it's.
Okay, no, you're right. Possibly it doesn't make a
specific
political point. Yeah.
I'm not saying that the ripples that are going to come out of Stephen Ward will rock the establishment one second time, but it is. I just think it's worth noticing that slant that is offered, which is so rare at the moment. And shouldn't. This is more like, as you said, if you've gone back to the 70s when it was a point, or the 60s when theatre was crusading and battling, this is a crusade that's already been won. But it is at least a crusade of some variety. Maybe crusade's really pushing it, but...
Enron.
Yes. Yes,
if you count
true.
that as a musical.
Yeah, it didn't do very well in everywhere, though,
well, it's done better than this.
No, that's very true.
Yes.
Although I don't understand... Well, right, why has this failed? It was described in one newspaper as a flop, and it's only a flop commercially.
That's
it's
right.
not a flop as a...
it wasn't a critical panic. It didn't get a complete panic.
No, the reviews are mostly very positive.
I think it's not a great success. Firstly, because I don't think it taps in any way into the zeitgeist. Just, you know, it may be about an issue. No, that's right. That's what I'm saying. I think it's not about a current issue. It's very much sort of... It's a nostalgia piece, actually. Yeah. I think that's pretty much its intention. It's not there to upset anybody or to be controversial. It's there for the busloads of people from the stockbroker belt that we saw there the night that we were at it. And fine, you know, and it'll probably do quite well of it to us, to Guildford and to Hampshire and wherever else.
I really hope it does to it.
And Bath and so on, you know. So, I mean, I think it's really for that crowd, and I don't think that crowd... Well... I don't think it was big enough for quite that crowd. I mean, if you look at the great success for that type of... that was pitched at that kind of audience of late, which would be the audience, the play, with Helen Mirren, that just pushed those buttons just that much more successfully. Yeah.
Can I ask another question, though? If this had been renamed, if it wasn't called Stephen Ward, and it was called Profumo ! Or
I wish it had been.
Or Scandal...
Or Keeler.
Do you think it would have done better?
Probably.
And this goes back to the George Stiles argument, that a story has to sell itself on its name.
Yes, I do think that there is something in that. I think Stephen Ward wasn't the best possible choice of title. The thing is, they must have all these previous attempts at it. Presumably, must have used up all those
halfway decent titles.
Those halfway decent titles. But yes, I think I don't know about Profumo ! But
you know what I mean, though.
But
what that represents.
But yes, but Scandal or something of that kind might have tipped it into the that's worth looking at category from maybe a few more people.
Just Musk mentioned a couple of little bits and pieces here. First of all, the branding of the piece. Now, we remarked upon this on the day.
Yeah. It's
very, very simple.
Yes.
White letters in a red box on a white background.
Yes.
You said it looks like a Richard Curtis film, I think.
Yes, I suppose
which is a
yeah.
British comedy. I saw it as a tabloid cover.
Yes, I think.
Which is, of course, the gutter press does come into Act 2. We see a nice set of caricatures of
yes,
News
I think you're
of the
right.
World reporters.
It's the birth of the red top, isn't it? And but yes, it looks very plain. It's sort of like a Donmar warehouse type of bit of packaging, or the old Museum of London logo.
We might have added to that idea that it's.
I'm surprised we
cheap.
don't get more photographs, and I suppose we do on the publicity, the general publicity.
Or make it look more like a newspaper.
Yeah, exactly.
Another reference is, if people are saying, well, why is Profumo important? There's 2 points. First of all, it did touch society in such a big way. We can go back, as we nearly always do, to something Michael Flanders said. Well, Flanders and Swan always, because they were doing lightly satirical shows,
yes,
touch upon all these things. He says, Michael Flanders says, he makes a reference to, there's no smoke without fire, and then he says, non-combustibus profumo.
Yes.
And he gets a huge laugh from that, and people immediately know what he's talking about.
Yes.
And secondly, or possibly thirdly, I suppose, the very last thing that we discussed on the night was that whilst the piece is highly entertaining and successful artistically in most cases, it misses the fundamental point, and this is where we came in, that it isn't just, the Profumo affair isn't just about what happens to John Profumo and Stephen Ward and Christine Keeler. It is about what happens to the establishment. And it's very briefly touched on by the Stephen Ward character at the end, when he's talking after his death and he's back in the waxworks.
Yes.
And he says, well, we did bring down the government, which is true in the sense that the government was removed from power at the next election in 1964.
Douglas Hume might have had as much to do with it.
I don't think so. I think Douglas Hume is unfairly blamed for that.
Well, anyway.
Yeah. But anyway, we have... but the Conservatives left office after a long run the year afterwards. We were saying what this doesn't really address is the bigger question about the fact that the establishment wins a Pyrrhic victory. They do get their patsy, their scapegoat, and they don't even have to worry about him going to prison and selling his memoirs when he comes out, because he in fact commits suicide. So it's the best of all worlds for them in one way. So the establishment wins, but
lasting damage was done.
But the establishment really loses because the lid has come off Pandora's box.
And then from that point onwards, it was just a succession of sexual scandals or personal scandals. Yeah. Whether it was Lucan, John Stonehouse, David Mellor, and so on.
Can't deny they're going to happen, because once it's happened once, it can always happen again.
Yeah.
Whereas you've always got the element of, well, this would never happen if it hasn't ever become public before.
Some of the attempts on this story have been more about the power of the press and more about sort of where that stands, and that to me is a current issue. The privacy and that issue. Yes, exactly. And interestingly, I don't think this does tackle that head on at all. And maybe that was a missed opportunity.
Well, we see press brutality, don't we?
We do, but it's, I think, very much incidental to the human story that is trying to tell. But there's definitely a story about that following on from Pravda, for example, by Howard Brenton.
And even more connectedly, just more recently, there's talking about massive corruption in the Metropolitan Police, and the police seemingly trying to argue against victims and defendants in cases. And I'm thinking of the Stephen Lawrence thing here. So that's just blown in the last few months. And of course, we've got here the claim that you've got a judge meeting with the prosecution barrister in order to stitch up Stephen Ward's case, and you've got the Home Secretary bringing in the police, the Commissioner of the Police Force, in order to fit Stephen Ward up and how they can best, what's the chances, maximising the chances of getting a conviction.
Yeah.
So, but they're throwaway. These are, as you say, these are throwaway incidentals in the second act, rather than being what it's all about.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. One thing I've just noticed, actually, in the programme, looking here, is and apropos of that, is that I was just flicking through the photographs of this guy hanging out with glamorous duchesses and whoever else.
This guy being Stephen Ward.
Being Stephen Ward, and thinking, he's sort of a bit like Kenneth Tynan, who sort of did a lot of that. And I've just noticed in the programme there's actually a quote from Kenneth Tynan on Stephen Ward, which reads, "Society created him, used him, ruthlessly destroyed him, and then closed ranks around his body." As much about Kenneth Tynan, I suspect, as it was about Stephen Ward.
Well, this takes us back to the outer and inner circle, isn't it? Because we were talking earlier about the outer circle within Stephen Ward's circle, but actually Stephen Ward is in the outer circle of the establishment.
Yes, that's
not
true.
Not the inner circle. But to wrap up, essentially, we're actually giving Andrew Lloyd Webber a big thumbs up for this, because the score is varied.
It's a bit of a return to form. I wouldn't necessarily say it's. I still don't think it's anything like any of his best, but it was nice to hear a little bit of dissonance.
To me, it's really. I admire him as a person, I haven't always liked his work, but this has really improved his reputation with me, and I'd like to see a lot more of this kind of thing. However, what we've not really spoken about are the lyrics by Don Black. Which
they also sound to me like they come from that sort of 70s era of him. So, I mean, Don Black, there are some great lyrics that Don Black has written. I don't think anybody would deny that, Born Free and so on.
But occasionally.
But there's a certain erraticness in Don Black as well that leads to things like Take Me to a Zoo That's Got Chimpanzees, Tell Me on a Sunday, Please. There's a little bit of barrel scraping that just happens every so often. And there's a lot of that in this. So while there's some really nice phrase making at times, that he's not shy of cliche.
No.
And I think he
doesn't escape cliche.
Fairly profusely in this. So, yeah.
There's a couple of scansion problems, but mostly in that opening number, which we didn't feel worked so well.
Well, it's just like one repeating motif over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Which is Tell Me on a Sunday.
Yeah, I suppose, yes, same problem. Maybe that's what they should learn from this. But, yeah, it repeats sort of... It just does a sort of continuous loop around this thing, and it scans it differently each time, so that some of the actor has to work quite hard to make it sound natural. I think Don Black is a pop lyricist, perhaps more than anything else, and I think that's always been one of the weaknesses he's got.
I've got this idea, because we've been talking about From Here to Eternity. You see, From Here to Eternity, I think the lyrics are stronger than the score. Yes. And I think in Stephen Ward, the score is stronger than the lyrics.
Yes.
I tell you what, if someone could persuade this Tim Rice and this Andrew Lloyd Webber to work together, they'd probably be very successful.
Those guys could be going somewhere, possibly to eternity. We'll see.
They could be the future of British musical theatre, having been the past.
Exactly, yes. They could, well, either to eternity or just too close to the flame. We would have to see.
I've got one further question. And we spoke about whether it will or won't go on tour, and I hope that it will.
I got one anecdote before you do that, actually, which is that I believe that some of the time the stuff that's happening, Joyce Grenfell was living on a cottage on the edge of the Clifton Estate.
Was she?
I believe so. I might check that out. I'll check that out. Yeah, she was friends with the Astors. In fact, she was related to the Astors. And Nancy was her aunt.
I assume, however, therefore, that her sainted name is untouched by this scandal.
I think her and Reggie Grenfell, I think they might have lived there a little before this, actually. Right. But it's interesting that you go from Joyce Grenfell in a single decade or whatever it was to
the fall of the
turpitude of Christine Keeler. Yeah, sorry, do go on.
Well, no, you've taken my breath away with it. I just genuinely didn't know that. We were talking about whether it might go on tour, and I certainly, for one, would hope that it would. I appreciate what you were saying, but it might play better to a Stockbroker Belt audience, and if it has to go to the Stockbroker Belt to do that, then that's fine. I think it's a show that I would like to see again at some stage. I certainly wouldn't say no to seeing it again. One of the reviewers in the newspaper said that this is really, or should be, it's been described actually more like a chamber opera than a musical. And one person said they would like to see it come back as a cabaret.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, you can see how that would work. I mean, it sort of is already, isn't it, in the staging, we were saying before, with the curtains and whatnot. So, yeah, maybe. Like, everybody sitting at tables all the way through and all the rest of it. That would be quite nice staging for it.
The ironic thing about this is a show that amateurs could do relatively easily if they had the skills.
I suspect it probably will show up on the amateur circuit at some point.
So, all in all, not at all a bad show. And certainly better than we thought.
Yeah, I didn't love it, but I can.
But you didn't hate it.
I didn't hate it, and I certainly saw some of its latent merits. And as I say, it was. I liked it more than any Lloyd Webber show really since Phantom, and so that's good.
I liked it more than any show by Andrew Lloyd Webber since before Phantom.
Yes.
So, but I liked it more. So, there we are. Well, there we are. Andrew Lloyd Webber, more of that, please.
Yes.
Keep it going, lad. Well, thank you very much, Tim. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
No problem.
Good, you're right. There was no problem.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Musical talk. Tim there discussing with me the new and indeed lamented musical Stephen Ward. Do give it a chance, even if you only buy the album. And if it does turn up somewhere near you, and I hope that it does, then give it a whirl. It is actually very much worth seeing. And it's a delight for me to be able to say, thank you, Andrew Lloyd Webber. That was an excellent show. Can we have a few more, please? Certainly in that vein. Well, just before we go, there is still a chance to catch another new British musical about another character hung out to dry by the British establishment, in this case in the 19th century. It's Oscar Wilde, because someone has turned De Profundis, one of the letters he wrote to Bosie, his part-time lover as it were, whilst he was in prison. It's a piece of rare sincerity from Oscar Wilde, and beautifully staged at the Leicester Square Theatre, right next to the Prince Charles Cinema off Leicester Square. Our old friend Michael Riley is currently the musical director, and it's on for a few more weeks. It's well worth seeing, so obey my orders, do as you're told, and go and see it. Well, for the time being, there's nothing further to say for this episode of Musical Talk, so I'm not going to waste time saying it. And instead, here's me saying goodbye. Here goes. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk produced and edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Savewood. Copyright Musical Talk 2014. And don't forget to make use of our social media interaction opportunities, namely Facebook, Twitter, etc, etc.
We do have a difference in directors, and I think this may have been instrumental when we're comparing those two things. Richard Eyre is the director of this one.
Richard Eyre? Is he Eyre?
Richard, I don't know. Let's
go
with Eyre.